Hello everyone, today I want to talk about the development of European countryside during the High Middle Ages and in parallel the relative migration that from the countryside invested the let's say the sleeping centers, at least what had been the relatively underdeveloped centers of Europe up to a certain point, and began the rise in the low Middle Ages of these consistent urban societies that eventually had a huge importance in medieval culture and civilization as a whole. And I want to make this video as essentially a history of society and economics, let's say, but really focusing on the, let's say, quantitative dimension of such phenomena that sometimes, in broad terms we discuss, but we we don't really treat, for instance, in comparison to one another. And today I would like to discuss, in fact, especially the relation between the let's say the reciprocal influence, let's say better, of countryside and cities into the so-called rebirth um, of the year 1000, and even making a bit of parallelisms with between the European societies and the Christian societies of Europe and the Muslim world in terms of development and of especially of city centers, and I hope it's gonna be interesting enough. So the first of all, we have to stress one thing, that is, whichever phase we are talking about, medieval history today, we will stretch essentially from within the central centuries of the Middle Ages in practice. But whichever medieval times you take as and society you describe, you're always talking about pre-industrial societies, and pre-industrial societies have as a normal, as and I'd say as a forced element for for obvious technological evidence of being essentially agricultural societies, meaning that all the labor, the work and activities that take place into urban centers, as developed as they can grow to be, will never essentially be the main form of let's say wealth of a certain country. And things began to change historically during the modern age only when cities basically were able to import from other markets such a huge amount of wealth to trigger the development of certain technologies that allowed an industrial scale of production, and began to change a bit the world. I say a bit because at the beginning it wasn't even such a huge impact. You have to wait to the 20th century before finding that the majority of people, at least in Western countries, began to leave into the cities and wasn't a peasant anymore. So this is very important because especially when we magnify the importance of medieval urban centers, sometimes we forget to to remind that outside the cities there was all another world that was the one of the countryside, which, by the way, was the one that in productive terms was able to make cities, had made possible the development of cities, not just in Middle Ages. I mean, take the ancient era, for instance, even in the Roman Empire, of course, as we were saying before. The majority of there were lots of people living into the cities, but still the vast majority of the population of the empire dwelled in the countryside. So sometimes what I'm trying to say is that sometimes we lack the counter perspective that instead was central to essentially define from a structural point of view the economical systems of the time, and the accomplishment of urban centers in terms of civilization. I mean, take the Renaissance. I mean, it was something born into the cities and into the city, into the city mind even, and but it was still possible because of the resources that were available from the countryside. And into this, there are even larger implications relatively to the differences that existed into Europe, because the Renaissance wasn't born, you know, up there in the far Scandinavian north. And there was a reason because of that, and as much as a reason why in Scandinavian cities, for instance, weren't that developed, because it was all about what the local country economy could really produce in terms of sheer size. And this affected, in turn, the so-called what Marx, that I don't like much politically speaking, but at least I appreciate as a politologist, for his times, a sociologist and an economist, as the superstructure that is essentially what eventually allows you to start thinking about something else, because until you're a peasant that has to survive basically, and therefore working continuously not to starve to death, you have no time for reading books. So the Renaissance could have not been born in a place where there wasn't such a huge amount of surplus to feed people just for studying all the day, all their life long, or to be artists, or to just do a lot of other things that wasn't what the largest part of the people did, which was working the land practically. So essentially, the rise of cities is something that started occurring. I mean, you can't really put a stick and saying, this is where in time or in places in the Middle Ages into which cities began to develop, because in in concrete terms, cities had always been there. During the early Middle Ages, there were definitely certain cities that had went uninhabited practically, or at least that to which their inhabited area radically shrank from the ancient world. But let's say that especially in some regions of Europe, cities had basically remained there as a normal reference point, and as trade centers, as essentially maintaining that function that they had had in the ancient world, but on a much smaller scale. And take into consideration that cities proper in Europe existed only where the Roman Empire had spread, because most of Europe before the Roman conquest didn't know cities as such. They were exported as a model of political and social organization of the Roman Empire. So there were vast areas of Central and Eastern Europe and Northern Europe that weren't urbanized. So we have to really put everything in relative terms. But usually, the moment in which we see a first structural rise of urban centers is roughly during the Carolingian time and post-Carolingian times, into which usually we name the beginning of the 8th centuries, especially in those cities that were already more more developed, like the one of the Lombard kingdom, for instance, because the lands of the Franks, especially in the north, had a much slower rise of cities, even though they existed in practice, although not really, or very slowly at least, just turning at that point as sort of political centers. And this is due usually to this. Here today it's very fashionable to explain everything through climate change, but most refined historiographies have rightfully argued that there is a tendency of humans to actually develop things is if there is enough space. It does take time, but I mean, why maybe didn't these guys expand? Just because they had room to do that and resources to do that, and therefore, up to that time they had just finished structuring their bases where they were already dwelling, and eventually began to expand. I personally believe in both things. I mean, I'm sure that there was some sort of environmental factor on a large scale, like a global warming, that might have triggered this growth. But there are also political reasons that, if you look at the map of Europe, are pretty evident. So what is important is that during Carolingian times, basically we have, and not really only thanks to the Carolingians, but for preset conditions, the development of certain activities that basically didn't revolve exclusively around the working of the land, but I'd say that in the this started happening actually into relatively peripheral lands of the Carolingian Empire, chiefly the southern and northern ones, because, as we were saying, the cities of Italy, of southern France, were already well, I don't know how to say that. That were already well launched, well placed for for developing. But there is also very interesting and important development into the coastal cities of the Channel, of the North Sea. The Baltic area was still to develop. That's so a major urban development, I think mostly only from the 12th century, but let's say that around the northern seas of Europe was starting an trade circulation that was increasing in size, and of which benefited these coastal cities of the Carolingian Empire, in spite of all the instability eventually that was brought by the Viking Age, that definitely destroyed a lot of centers, but also practically made happening the rise of others, and really put in motion a lot of goods, a lot of traffics that ultimately launched the economy, and used it as used them as definitely a stimulus, we can say, a flywheel. That's the term I wanted to to use. And the reasons why this in the north, we've said it, there were essentially these Germanic populations that were, even if you take the Anglo-Saxons, that were structuring their own monarchy, we're progressively, trying even to organize these new traffics on a more, or on a longer range, or at least on a more rationalized organization. Let's say in the south of Europe, the reasons are pretty obvious. There was already a very strong urban net, as we at least for those time standards, as we've seen. These cities were often placed on very important trade routes of the Mediterranean. They were coastal cities, but there were also other let's say, terrestrial centers that were definitely catalyzing the emergence of new traffics that, by the way, were also linked with the one of Northern Europe, and that's the reason why eventually even these two areas grow to be the more developed, more advanced in terms of urban culture in the full Middle Ages, let's say. And there was also a flywheel also in the south that was essentially represented by the Byzantine Empire, that definitely had a great importance in keeping alive certain contacts between the Western and Eastern Mediterranean, and that definitely was based on a maritime strategy in a certain measure. But let's say that the Christian powers of Southern Europe were also definitely trading with the Muslims, that weren't just the enemies of the faith, but were also trade partners when when it was possible. This was all done, by the way, both in the south and in the northern Europe through warfare. Take Viking era, as violent as it could be, as for all the military operations that were triggered by the main political events. And also in the south of Europe, the Italian maritime republics were fighting actively against the Muslims, doing piracy. So essentially doing also what the Saracens had been doing up to that time, but really taking very slowly the upper hand over them. So really even Christianizing certain areas like the the western, there were many Mediterranean islands at this time, both in the west and in the eastern Mediterranean, were claimed back from the Muslims. So this all went into parallel with very dynamics that are very complexly intertwined, so that there are so many factors actually that played into this. And the So if you start looking at Latin Germanic Europe between the 10th and the 11th century, what you see very clearly is that the urban centers were fastly rising in demographically speaking, and both for the traffics but also because these traffics had allowed to accumulate enough resources to develop other forms of working, like crafts. There were a lot of artisans at this point who were producing manufactures and exporting them. So people who just didn't live just of the working the land, but really having enough surplus deriving from trade in order to live of this production that could be, however, still combined in some form. Definitely also, especially in Southern Europe, certain countrysides were actually specializing into producing particular goods, so the artisan life didn't exclusively belong to cities, even though it mostly, let's say. So the this scenario, however, and this is really the point of the video, you do not have to forget one thing, that really on manuals of medieval history, on history books, you find, oh yes, this is such a good moment because look at the cities, how much they're rising. And that, according to me at least, this is an impression I have had subjectively through my experience. I don't really if you didn't do the same mistake, it's obviously fine. But I get the impression that there is a sort of perspective mistake for which it seems that the economical rebirth of Europe into these centuries was essentially only thanks to cities, but this is actually not true. And as we were saying before, what you see in Europe, which is, by the way, not something you find really elsewhere, at least not in the same dimension, let's say, is that it was actually the countrysides that were backing this growth. I mean, the largest expansion at this time that you can find is at a demographical and productive level. It was happening into the countryside, where the majority of people lived, and that really was, in this sense, expanding as a very big phenomenon, because Europe, yeah, it wasn't very densely populated, but we're still talking about tens of millions. So this is not really just a small thing. This is really that also for the future history of the world would have produced very important centers. So we can say actually that the world rebirth really started from the countryside. I mean, if the cities eventually were able to basically retake or at least acquire the role of vigorous centers of coordination and propulsion, let's say, like it was happening, for instance, in the Byzantine or Islamic worlds. It was really the rural world that was reorganizing the whole settlements, and that agrarian expansion that we can observe, especially during the development of the manorial system and more in general, and the birth of feudalism. So there wasn't just a great increase in commerce at this time. It definitely did exist, but there is also a sheer increase in the amount of people, because this is also a massively demographic thing, and of goods, of resources, that in this sense was really at the base of the economical renewal that was much more evident eventually in the following centuries, and that would have been so much praised, mostly because in perspective more, let's say, about the relatively to the urban achievements rather than the one of the countryside. So very importantly, we have to say, however, that definitely merchants, and therefore people who, we can't say they came from cities, but necessarily, but that they were definitely attracted by cities as trade centers, had a great role into this. I mean, they played really an important role. Eventually in managing this expansion. It wasn't a disordered expansion. It was actually very well channeled one. But there was also a lot of self-organization among the rustics, and the rural area in a general sense. And under this point of view, what I like to stress above all other things is the role that feudalism actually had into this process. Because sometimes we think that the the feudalism was like the opposite of economical dynamism. There is a lot of political delirium, I believe, in today's society when from all sides actually when discussing about the past, like really judging medieval politics or society or economics on the base of our 21st century societies. For what reason I don't really understand, mostly because probably people don't know anything about the Middle Ages, but more uh, really, especially from certain areas of the world, there is a sort of moralistic obsession that actually transfers in itself into radicalism and into fanatism in many ways. And people need to depict feudalism as an oppressive system. So, first of all, yes, feudalism was an oppressive system, but which other systems existed at the time? Like, do you think that cities were not oppressive in the way they were, created? Do you think they didn't pass from the slaughtering of other people, of the exploitation of the peasants, for instance, or that they didn't wage wars, that were all these peaceful merchants that had no business at all into military things and all? This is completely false. And if you actually look at feudalism, you understand that there was actually a much greater amount of redistribution into that world for the sake of agricultural production, by the way, than actually into the cities. I mean, the city classes actually rose in a pretty uncontrolled way that eventually produced the progressive stratification of urban classes that ended up just like similarly to feudalism with a very few wealthy guys at the top and then the mass of salaried workers that were treated as slaves practically. And in the feudalism, you can argue, yes, it was roughly the same. Probably, of course, the cities were more, let's say, I can't say democratic because democratic is really a very strong word for the medieval city regimes. But I mean, in the etymological sense of the word, at least, they had a larger egalitarian ideal, but it was still, for our standards, an extremely oppressive system. So what I'm trying to say, however, is that feudalism really channeled and put in motion a lot of resources that eventually were put into circulation eventually on the markets, and that actually favored the rise of trade centers that were usually revolving around cities. So even if you take the fairs, I made a video about the rise and fall of champagne fairs, and you understand that these fairs were actually organized by cities. I mean, Champagne was an extremely fertile area, and that's the reason why those fairs were possible, because of the agricultural surplus. But it's the same reason why those cities were there, because they had been literally built by the part of that same surplus that eventually was still enough to sell and to acquire more surplus. So it's very interesting even how these things worked. So when we look at this great expansion of the Middle Ages, economical expansion, definitely tank cities if you want to tank them, I don't know, but always tank too, in that case, feudalism, because it was really feudalism that made things work. And the way it happened through oppression, definitely, but definitely without feudalism, what you would have had would have been practically much more divided small stripes of lands, maybe worked very anarchically with small owners that essentially minded each one their own business. And if they had not joined together in some more organized and hierarchical forms, they might have maybe lived better as freemen, as individuals, because they might have not been subjected to a lord. which by the way in practice never happens, because eventually if you are well off enough, you immediately try to oppress your neighbor in some way with some mean. But the same, even the same amount of crop rates that I mean of income, of surplus deriving from agriculture, would have not be put in motion as rationally, as let's say aimedly, um, as during into the feudalism. Feudalism, for instance, could do also another thing, that was producing um, um, let's say specialized cultures. For instance, we know this from the Carolingian politics of northern France, of northern Italy, that there were, especially in the latter, very specialized local productions that were evidently there because there was a market that was demanding for that specific product, and not just the amount of wheat that was needed to feed the local population. So, excuse me, it was ultimately feudalism that brought to this reprisal, and in turn allowed or favored, at least very strongly, the urban centers to develop. And another very important dynamic that happened at this time, really in parallel to all this, was the we talk about the great demographical expansion that occurred, and in turn this produced the migratory flux from the countries to the cities, to the countryside to the city, which is a kind of mm, world, let's say, historically wide phenomenon, in the sense that even here in you know in post-industrial societies, this happened because the cities had work. So really the reasons were the same. But what I'm saying is that in post-industrial times, the rise of cities in this is and generally speaking of demographics was extremely high. Certain population growth rhythms that were unknown to pre-industrial societies. So when we look at pre-industrial societies, and we look especially at the development of cities, we have to understand that these cities weren't really born out of concrete local demographic growth. Please do not make this mistake. It's not that in the cities, since they had more surplus, they copulated like rabbits, and they multiplicated them within the city walls to rise incredibly of of extremely high levels of percentage. It was actually all due to immigration into the city from the countryside. And this is, by the way, how in pre-industrial society normally cities do expand. Of course, this means that a city is able to provide enough resources for maintaining such large amount of populations. By the way, the living conditions of most citizens, not much, maybe not of the citizens, but all the peasants that arrived there to work, maybe as salaried workers into the local manufacturers and textile production that was in fact pretty much dwelling into northern Italy and in Flanders, lived in pretty miserable conditions, but yet sometimes was better, still better than what they did into the countryside. There were also political reasons to this, because it is said, even though the reality is a bit more complex, that basically there is this saying that the city air makes you free, as in the Middle Ages, because there was a law somewhere, I don't even remember, that said that basically if a lord's servant went to the city for, like, I don't know, 1 year and 1 day, the lord couldn't claim that guy back as his own serf, practically. the reality is a bit different. This is a bit of a poetic metaphor. The idea is that cities were rising in part as in competition, in broad terms, with the nobility of that was which was the feudal one usually of the countryside. This eventually brought, because cities were getting more dynamic in many ways. I mean, we said that it was the countryside that backed the city growth, but cities were, as communities, in this sense, smaller than the ones of the countryside. So basically, they could make a big amount of money by just exploiting the divisions between the same rural lords, or just fitting into these gaps that were that existed within the countryside economical system. So eventually, and they were much more competitive than on average than the uh, uh, local lords, let's say, in term as basically as great estates owners and therefore who produced goods that were, as we've seen, put on the market as well. So the idea is that the city, however, was eventually the feudal lords lost this thing, at least in certain this race, let's say, at least in certain areas of Europe, the feudal lords basically sold most of what they had, and they urbanized. They became, eventually they entered into cities. Also in here we should specify that really cities in most cases were still ruled by the rural aristocracies. This is very important, but it's also a very complex thing. But this is just for saying that behind this growth, that there are wide social, religious, and political implications that really escape any form of very strict generalization and systematization. However, the idea is exactly this: that eventually the feudal system was feeding its own rivals into this, embodied by the cities, and this brought in many regions a sort of crisis of change. Relatively to this, and I would like to conclude with this observation, we can see that, to make a general comparison here between the Christian Europe and the Islamic world, because what was happening in Europe was, as you understood, we started from the 8th centuries. Here we arrived to the crisis of the, let's say, to the 12th century. A very large amount of time, like half of a millennium. And you understand that this was a very slow process. So it's not that like today, that there is a change and you can talk with past generations and saying, it was so different at your time. I mean, these were changes so slow that probably nobody understood them as such at the time, at least if not after a certain amount of understanding of reflection. Today we know enough about these things to actually observe that what was happening in Europe was something happening really slowly, but however at a massive level in quantitative terms. This is really not the Islamic world at the time was more advanced than the Christian one. I mean, if you take the 8th century, I mean, take the caliphate, the Abbasid caliphate, and confronted it with Carolingian Europe. I mean, let's say yes, probably even the Carolingian Empire wasn't that backwards compared to the caliphate, but in practical terms, Mesopotamia was very was much wealthier, more technologically advanced than Northern Europe, definitely at this time. However, Europe, and by the way, into the Islamic world, together by the way with the Byzantine one, because this is also an important thing to bear in mind, that the Carolingian feudal structures are very different from the one of other areas of Europe. And we're talking therefore mostly about Western Europe. I say it Christian Europe, which is fine, because eventually Christianity spread even through the channel of this new feudalism. So we're not talking really about Eastern Europe, or at least the areas that were untouched by feudalism at this time, that were still developing similarly but in different forms. And just making comparison between Western Europe and the Islamic world and the Byzantine one, is that in the latter, in the Islamic world and Byzantine ones, the cities were still basically crucial. Were already much more developed in some cases than the one in the West still, that were still really very slowly growing and developing. But eventually, probably, especially the Islamic world, lacked that development of the countryside that instead triggered the rebirth of the year 1000 in the West. The rebirth actually happened also into, broadly speaking, Eurasia. I mean, it's not just a Western European prerogative, but the greatest growth was definitely there. And eventually, the Christian world didn't really surpass the Islamic one for many centuries in history, but the European cities really surpassed in terms of power, economical dynamism, and military power in general, and political influence, the ones of the Byzantines and of the Muslims. The and the whole thing probably, I don't have a better explanation. I can't think that obviously the Islamic world was, if you take Africa aside from Egypt in practice, you understand that there wasn't a huge potential in terms of agricultural production, because most of the hinterland is arid, if not desertic. The same goes for great part of the Near East, for which eventually well, this is probably very relative as an explanation, very mechanic. I don't think it is really good, but probably the explanation is much more political. I mean, I think that the Christian aristocracies and churches that were really powerful were sort of finding an increasing amount of interlocutors even at a lower level, even among the rustics that sometimes were organizing themselves in a certain fashion. Also because of the extremely active group of the merchants that were really connecting all over the continent, and this net of cities and all the therefore the principalities and kingdom within these within which these centers were expanding. So eventually Europe became, even if divided politically speaking, something extremely coriaceous to crack, essentially. I mean, it became a huge economical power in itself. Really, it began to grow. I mean, if you look really at the lower medieval centuries, you understand that Europe was something huge economically speaking. and it kind of woke up from an early medieval time that instead seemed as if everything had slowed down to a sort of thermic death. And such huge reprisal is something that you don't find really in the especially of the cities. It's something you don't find into Islamic world. You find similar dynamics. You find a similar growth even in size, but you do not find the same demographic and urban expansion that occurred in Europe, which was something huge, really. And I think much has really to do. Well, we can't really explain it now because otherwise it takes too long. But a lot of this probably had to do, in my opinion, with the political and social organization of Europe in itself, even before the strictly structural terms, because um, these structural terms were pretty much influenced by, for instance, the Carolingians. Feudalism in this was extremely important. Then naturally, yes, there were also environmental factors, and sometimes it's very difficult to talk about these things because we have in the West this prejudice that I don't know that there were a certain point the Dark Ages. So we have in turn to magnify even the following economical rebirth as something prodigious in some measure. Definitely Europe always had a great potential, environmentally speaking, in terms of climate, in terms of soils, in terms of even just geographical location, ways of communications, the Mediterranean, the rivers, the northern seas. I mean, there is really a lot that in Europe, obviously, that Europe owed to its own environment. But I still think that if you take the Byzantine Empire, for instance, that was still actually was more territorially speaking, it was more Asian rather up to a certain point than European geographically speaking. But even into the European lands of the Byzantine Empire, they weren't extremely different. Yeah, I mean, Greece and the southern Balkans are not extremely fertile. Actually, the Byzantines had a pretty good crop rate at one point, if I'm not wrong. So maybe this is also a mistake. I believe that in this sense there weren't many different starting conditions between West and East. But what you see is that the Byzantine Empire eventually collapsed. That at the end of the Middle Ages, these southern European, Eastern European lands were kind of lagging far behind even countries so close like Italy, for instance, and also other European realities. And you understand that that was really tied to political and cultural things. Really, even the Byzantine distrust for economical activities, that is something very famous for trade. In fact, the certain crystallized view of society that had more difficulties to change, to really to expand. I mean, there were certain Greek cities that Constantinople basically choked in their economical expansion because they didn't want them eventually to rebel from to the empire, like it had happened, for instance, with the Italian cities and the Holy Roman Empire. So there was, and even here, the two conditions were quite different. But it's as if really much of this Western European expansion that eventually led directly into the Renaissance, into the modern age, into eventually during colonialism, the European rule of the world, really probably has to do not just with structural factors, but with superstructural ones. I mean, politics, society, um, meant as groups of individuals, really, probably even in the mindset, really did make a difference under this point of view. And it's very meaningful for me to say this, because usually I favor kind of structural structural interpretation. This really instead seems to be a kind of an ideal one, an idealistic one. So it's there is politics is extremely important, and the way it shapes productive structures uh, are extremely important to bear in mind, according to me. But for now, it's enough. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you want to receive further contents about my from my channel. For now, I just thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.